All right, it's Mrs. Zimnick again. Bet you could have guessed that. It is, I'm going to be talking about the age of reform. A lot of this information is from chapters 10 and 11. So let me just remind you, this is in no way, shape, or form a substitute for careful reading of chapters 10 and 11. But what I want you guys to do is to really think about these reformers during this era. We're talking about the 1820s to about the 1850s, give or take a little. And I want you guys to think about how they changed things, how they were reflective of the changes going on in the United States during this time. And last but not least, who do you think is the most influential as far as changing American culture, and we still see their influence today? So think about that, because I'm going to ask you guys to do something with that. All right, so let's go through. All right, I'm going to start you off by talking about religious reform. We're going to get into some religious reformers. Our first friend we want to meet is Charles Grandison Finney. So Finney is going to be one of the major preachers in the Second Great Awakening. Okay, what makes him different than the First Great Awakening? Remember Jonathan Edwards? Remember Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God? God hated you. God was ready to flick you into the pits of hell, right? This is a kinder, gentler God here in the Second Great Awakening. It was just religious revivals among Protestants. Actually, the Erie Canal did a lot to spread this Second Great Awakening. A lot of it's going to be around the Erie Canal, so I think that's evidence of how it was reflecting the changes in American culture. And this had the biggest impact among women. We definitely see women are going to get more status and purpose as a result. And some of this also has to do with the fact that with the factory system, men were gone quite a bit more than before. Women's place at home tended to increase their role at home a bit. So the other thing we're going to see, frontier revivals are going to be big. They're going to feature really emotional appeals. So you see that influence of emotion happening here with Finney. Okay, other religious reforms that we need. It is pouring, by the way, so if this is loud, I apologize. I'm talking directly into the microphone, but it's pouring outside. My room's kind of loud. Ann Lee and the Shakers. You know Shaker Heights, Ohio? Yeah, named after the Shakers. So Ann Lee is nicknamed Mother Ann. She is going to be kind of the foundation of this religious group. What we're going to see, they were really socially radical. They kind of abolished the whole idea of having a nuclear family. They practiced complete celibacy and full equality between the sexes and the genders. So complete equality here. The trouble is if you're celibate, eventually you're going to die off, right? So that's why we don't see the Shakers last permanently, but their influence in this period can't be really discarded. They definitely have an influence and tried to just live very simple lives. The Mormons. So Joseph Smith is really kind of considered almost a prophet here for the Mormon church. He organizes his church in 1830, and the basis behind the Mormon church is that he found supposedly a missing text of the Bible. And because of that, he was supposed to preach the message and basically create followers. And so that's what he did. So he starts preaching that he found a missing text of the Bible. Needless to say, some people felt he was a little crazy for that. So he's going to be persecuted. His followers will be persecuted. They have to move from New York to Ohio, actually in Kirtland. He spent time in Kirtland, Ohio, over on the east side of Cleveland, to Missouri, and finally to Illinois, where he was actually murdered by a mob, so because of his beliefs. After Smith's murder, Brigham Young will be the next major leader of the Mormons, will lead the migration to Utah, where Salt Lake City is going to be where the Mormons settle. And even today, you see a huge influence of the Mormon faith in Utah, and especially in Salt Lake City, with Brigham Young University and many universities and Mormons living in Utah. All right, so getting into more the social and utopian experiments. This is something we're going to see be evidence because socialism as an idea is growing in Europe. That's going to come over here. So utopian societies, we see really two attempts at this. There's one in New Harmony, Illinois, and this was a socialist center founded by a guy named Robert Owen. He's actually coming over from Europe, and obviously his goal, like any socialist society, was to be completely self-sufficient. He wanted it to exist without currency. This is obviously not a photograph, but this is a sketching of what happened here. Needless to say, it did not last very long. We've kind of seen that happen in many true attempts at a true utopia, and it just didn't quite work. So the experiment didn't really work. Another one we're going to see is in Brook Farm in Indiana. And you'll definitely see the influence of transcendentalism in Brook Farm. I'll get to that in a bit. Other areas of early social reform, we're going to see, especially with many of the Irish and German immigrants coming, many of them were Catholic, as you guys learned in world history, and that was definitely a source of some tension amongst what we're going to see nativism over here. Nativism is basically, it's thinly veiled racism, or it's prejudice against certain groups, and so we learned that many of the founders of America were Protestant in nature, and so they're going to be threatened by the influx of Catholic immigrants. And so what they're going to do, some of them are going to direct that towards the temperance movement. So we can't deny that some of the temperance movement was definitely anti-immigrant. Not all of it was, though. Some of it was really just an attempt to clean up what was happening with the cities, the growing cities, as we see, especially in the East, our urban centers starting to have areas that are already slums and kind of disadvantaged. And so many people felt that alcohol was the reason for that. So the American Temperance Union is going to be one of the groups that really fights to change that and gets alcohol completely banned. In Maine, they actually pull that off. They get a law in Maine where they do ban alcohol temporarily, but the temperance movement definitely had a lot of support from women, but also supported by factory owners who had a lot of absenteeism on Mondays, and they tried to blame that on alcohol. So we'll see that this is going to be one attempt. Other early areas of social reform, we see Thomas Gallaudet is going to push for schools for the deaf. And this is, remember, a time where if you had a learning disability or you couldn't see or you couldn't hear, you didn't get an opportunity to learn. And Gallaudet really felt like that was wrong, that should be changed. And so he's going to push for reforms for the deaf. Dorothea Dix is another reformer who's really going to push to reform prisons and hospitals, which were almost interchangeable at that point. If you had a psychological disorder, even something as relatively common today as bipolar disorder, depression, or more serious like schizophrenia, you would just be locked away like an animal in a prison cell. And she said this is wrong and really fought to change it. William Lloyd Garrison, he is going to be one of our key abolitionists. He's definitely pretty radical. He's going to rip up the Constitution at public rallies. He never once voted because he felt that the American government was too corrupt to save. But what he does do is he publishes a newspaper called The Liberator, which is really a model for the abolitionist movement, and tries to get his ideas out there. Frederick Douglass, another key member of the abolitionist movement, he himself being a former slave, was taught how to read and never looked back, and escaped from slavery and will be kind of the biggest voice in the anti-slavery movement from a former slave's perspective. He will work tirelessly to end slavery. Known for giving pretty fiery speeches, he will work side by side with Lincoln during the Civil War, and he will be just really pushing for not only an end to slavery, but eventually for civil rights. Speaking of civil rights, we'll see the women's rights movement kind of spins out of the abolitionist movement, because a lot of abolitionist meetings would have women sit in the back or, kind of segregate them. And a lot of women were like, wait a second, does anybody notice the hypocrisy in that? So Lucretia Mott is one such person who did, and many women's rights activists got their start in the abolition movement and then kind of felt like, we need to have our own here. We need to talk about, let's get some women's rights too while we're at it. So we'll see the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 is a meeting of women like Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They'll actually draw up something called the Declaration of Sentiments, which is really similar to the Declaration of Independence, but kind of rewrote it to more apply to women. Sarah and Angelina Grimke are also two well-known women's reform activists who got their start in the abolitionist movement. So shifting a bit to writers, let's talk a little bit about writers. So pretty early on, we really just saw American writers really copying European writers. Our very early American writers like James Fenimore Cooper, he writes Last of the Mohicans, great movie by the way. He's really still copying the European style. Same thing with our early painters, Charles Wilson Peale, Gilbert Stuart. They're just imitating Europe. It's a lot of portraits, right? Gilbert Stuart is the one who painted the portrait of George Washington that Dolly Madison famously saved in the War of 1812. We start to see a little bit of a shift from classicism to romanticism, though, and this is where we're going to start to get our truly American writers. Romantics were revolting against what they felt was the bloodless logic of the Age of Reason. So many romantic writers felt like, reason is good, to an extent, but you need to go with your gut. Kind of the idea that we see Immanuel Kant coming up with during the Enlightenment. There's only so much you can do with reason, right? You're going to see this in a lot of the paintings. So the Hudson River School is really just given to a name of artists who met, obviously, in upstate New York, and Thomas Cole, Asher Durand, Albert Bierstadt. These are some of the painters who are going to start to really show the influence of the West, definitely. A lot of what they're painting are large landscapes, and a lot of what they're painting you can kind of see here. It looks like light is coming out of the painting. I mean, that to me is just unreal. Even over here, this is Kindred Spirits. Whoa, let me go back. That one's called Kindred Spirits. It's actually by Cole. Oh my gosh. Sorry. There we go. This one's Kindred Spirits, and it's by Cole with Durand in it. They put themselves in the painting. Just, you can see the idea of possibilities and emotion and what could be here. Our transcendentalists. Okay, these are really first truly American literary movement, based in New England, and transcendentalists wanted to transcend or kind of go above and beyond what was logical and what had reason. They advocated rejecting reason, and especially rejecting laws sometimes if the laws are incorrect. So Emerson is kind of the original one. Thoreau was actually one of his students and goes on to become probably the most well-known transcendentalist for his work on Walden Pond, where he literally spent, a long time living by himself and just wrote about just simplifying your life. And a lot of it really resonates today, too. I think you can think about our fast-paced culture, and a lot of the things that these transcendentalists were preaching are things that a lot of self-help books today try to say. I think probably the most influential thing Thoreau writes is civil disobedience, and we're going to make reference to this a lot, especially when we get into the civil rights movement. What happens is Thoreau is upset because the Mexican-American War is going on, and he feels that is only to expand slavery. So he's got a problem with that. And because of that, he is going to basically say, well, I'm not going to pay my tax. I'm not going to pay my poll tax because that money goes to expand slavery, and I'm against that. So he gets thrown in jail. While he's in jail, he writes Civil Disobedience, and it lays out some pretty eloquent language about how sometimes you need to break laws to make a point. So that's just kind of I think, an important thing that he writes that really affects everybody from Nelson Mandela, Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Lech Walesa. Tremendous influence on the 20th century. And on the 19th, for that matter, and what's going to happen, with the Civil War, it's going to affect that. So our transcendentalist writers, we have different writers. We've got, anything from our dark romantics. These are more romantic writers, I should say. Romanticism is going to reject reason, focus more on going with your heart, especially if it challenges the system or even breaks laws. So Edgar Allan Poe is definitely one of our dark romantics, known for writing The Raven, and just really, really dark, kind of heavy literature out of Poe. Nathaniel Hawthorne is another romantic writer. He writes, probably the most famous thing he writes is The Scarlet Letter, and you guys might have to read this. I actually think it's really good. I know some people don't like it. He's writing about Puritan New England, and this is Hester Prynne. She's the main character, and she has to wear a red A on her chest. It's kind of hard to see because she committed adultery. And what he's writing here is really very critical of Puritan New England, in a way critical of the church, critical of gender rights, and so it's pretty advanced for his time, for sure, and it's still considered a pretty controversial writing even today. Herman Melville, we learned a little bit about the influence of the whaling industry and whale oil, and so Moby Dick is probably his most well-known about the whaling industry. And Walt Whitman writes Leaves of Grass, amongst many other things. He's going to be a romantic poet, very, very influential, and just a real unique, truly American poet. So as American culture develops, we definitely see the changes in everything from architecture and art. I'm going to show you some more pictures, but architecture and style, we're seeing a shift away from the Enlightenment, the classic style, to a little bit more of a Gothic style. You'll see that in houses, you'll see that in churches and buildings. And again, that's kind of paralleling what the Romantic movement was all about, rejecting reason. So the Hudson River School is just a couple more pictures. I mentioned Kindred Spirits by Asher Durand. This is a group of artists in the 1830s, 40s. This one actually is painted in 1860. But these are pretty well known, and you can just see these are truly American. They're American landscapes. There's a lot of, you can interpret this as being very hopeful, looking towards the west. So it's really reflective of the changes that are happening in the time. This one is one of my favorites at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I love this one, again, because it's a painting, But to me, like, that is so much talent. I can't even imagine how to make, it looks like the sun is setting right here. Like, it looks, if you didn't know any better, you'd think that was a photograph. This is Frederick Church, Twilight in the Wilderness. So next time you're at the Cleveland Museum of Art, check that out.